episode of Afterlife Apologetics with myself, Charlie, and your great friend and expert, Steve, Dr. Steve Miller, who's, by the way, we'll be going through his book today. We're going to be finishing this up. For those of you who are new here, we study near-death and deathbed experiences and their relevancy in helping us determine what worldview is true or not. Now, we have gone through a lot of lines of evidence for these deathbed experiences, and this will be the final episode where we mop up the last two lines of evidence that Steve has here. We're going to touch briefly on after-death communications once I'm done with a quick review. Now, the review is just to help catch you guys up to speed. If you have not, or rather, if you want more detail, if you want to go further in depth on these, okay, just go back to the previous episode. This is episode 22. I think we began 4 episodes ago, so episode 18 or 19, where we start. You can just go back and look at the titles, and it'll tell you which one we start on. But I'm going to review these really quickly for you guys so that we can kind of know exactly where we're at. Get up to speed here, and then hopefully, Steve, I'd like if we could try to get through these and then get through all the lines of evidence, including the ones we want to talk about today, and then kind of do a summary of the whole thing and get your closing thoughts and my closing thoughts on it. So really quickly, guys, we're going to do a quick review here. So the ability to influence our time of death by solely mental means seems unlikely given a naturalist, materialist, physicalist theory of the brain. Okay, so that's line of evidence number 1, suggesting that when people are near their death, they are able to manipulate when and where they die. It's kind of like this willing effect to will themselves to live a little bit longer. Under naturalistic means, we would not expect that to be possible. We would expect people to, wouldn't really matter what your will was, you would die when your body wanted to die. Under naturalism, how could we know, this is line 2, under naturalism, how could we know we are dying without sufficient physical predictors of death? This again is like a supernatural knowledge where people have a feeling of the impending death coming towards them, and they're able to forecast it for the people around them that, hey, I'm probably going to die tomorrow, or I am going to die tomorrow. And sure enough, it comes true, even though we would have no reason to think that that's the case. Number 3, naturalism indicates that people should not be able to have accurate premonitions of the death of others. We spent a great deal talking about this one, and essentially this is people having premonitions or visions of other people and in their passing, and this would be something to the effect of perhaps you saw your mother visit you at night in your room, and it's like, oh, this is incredibly real, but I for some reason believe that they had passed on, right? And so within that, you would be able to have an accurate premonition of others. You would call to confirm, and then of course your mother had passed on, and you had had an encounter with them in your very bedroom. Steve, anything to add to that one?
No, I just say that each of these are things, if you want to look at it scientifically, you've got 2 hypotheses, the afterlife hypothesis and the dying brain hypothesis. And what we're asking is each of these observations that have been done by legitimate researchers with very good research that I document, we're saying these don't seem to fit well within a naturalistic framework. They do seem to fit better into a framework saying there is an afterlife, there is a soul that can exit from the body.
Yeah, and I want to add to that as Steve mentioned, when you look at them in a cumulative case, right? We want to see these stacked up side by side. We have been looking at them in a vacuum to some degree, but nonetheless, when we're talking about these being strong evidence for the afterlife hypothesis, we're referring to them collectively as a group, not necessarily them individually. Okay.
So think of it as think of legal science. You have Exhibit 1, Exhibit 2, Exhibit 3 that are brought to a court. So you have multiple lines of evidence, and you're saying, okay, what fits best with this, that this person's guilty or that they're innocent?
Yeah. Excellent point. Okay, so if deathbed experiences are either normal dreams or hallucinations, then why are the dying often surprised to see people on the other side who are not known to have died? Okay, so this again falls under the category of supernatural knowledge in the sense that if my friend Mike is really healthy and I go down and I'm on the deathbed and now I'm having a deathbed experience, I'm having a deathbed vision, and I go, oh, I see Mike over there. And maybe the room wanted to ease my suffering, and so they didn't want to tell me that Mike had passed yesterday. He had come down with an illness or got into a car accident or something, and he had died suddenly. But now I'm sitting in bed without the knowledge of Mike's passing and saying, oh, I see Mike over there. And everybody in the room would be like, what are you talking about? Mike died yesterday. So again, this is something I would consider supernatural knowledge, meaning we don't really have a naturalistic explanation of giving this person the knowledge. Okay, so line of evidence 5. Since brain deteriorating diseases such as Alzheimer's and dementia and meningitis render brains more and more dysfunctional, then how under naturalism do patients with these diseases often experience sudden lucidity, indicating consciousness, optimal brain function, memories, and rationality before dying? Okay, so we spent a good time camped on these following phenomena because of how fascinating they were to me personally. I was talking about it like a car with no engine able to start up and run, right? And so within these frameworks, we want to understand, why is it that when someone who has deteriorating mechanical capacities within the brain itself, so the actual material that would be performing the function, if that is deteriorating, then why are they able to have a sudden lucidity, what is commonly referred to as a terminal lucidity, right before they're passing? This is also seen in the next line of evidence, which is the lifelong mentally challenged sometimes become lucid, clear communicators, and thinkers at the time of death. In that one, Steve read out a great story where there was a woman who'd spent her whole life pretty much as a wild person, wasn't able to put together a coherent sentence, could barely speak coherently, had incredibly irrational, dangerous behavior, and yet when she neared her death, the doctors noted her just sitting there and singing very clearly, very beautifully, a hymn, and they were able to make out very clearly the words that she was saying. So you could tell she was singing a classical hymn. And so this is a phenomenon that kind of made them feel uneasy, and I think it makes others feel uneasy that somebody's in there. It just seems that they're trapped behind these mechanical failures of the body. Just like if an arm is broken, I could still mentally want to try to move the arm, but be mechanically incapable because of maybe muscle tissues damaged, maybe the bone is damaged, maybe tendons are damaged. But either way, I have the capacity, I have the potentiality to actuate that arm movement. It's just mechanically I'm unable to do so. So we see that same thing happening within the brain. And so it suggests there is a operator of the computer, as it were, that is unable to get the computer to cooperate. But right at the time of death, it seems like they get that opportunity, and those mechanical issues are not there for a moment. If deathbed experiences can be, this is the next line of evidence, if deathbed experiences can be fully attributed to physical characteristics of the dying brain, then how do we explain deathbed phenomena being shared at the bedside by the living who have healthy brains? So these are shared experiences. These are people who are sitting at the deathbed with their family members, and then they also are experiencing either you could help me out, Steve, with some of the characteristics here. I know one of them was talking about the portal that they saw that their family member went through, and they said that it looked like the Shenandoah Bridge. I know that's an example of some of these experiences where people are reportedly seeing other people in the room with them to usher them off. And so we see those any other kind of characteristics that you would say that would fall under that one?
Well, especially sight. Sometimes there are other senses involved as well. But what this means is that people who say, oh, well, this is all caused by the characteristics of the dying brain. Well, these are not people who are dying. So you can't really attribute it to a dying brain, because the healthy that are experiencing them, kind of like I mentioned, my relative Bucky, who had experienced his dad's death. And it was at the same time, he wasn't really at the bedside, but he shared the death of his dad in some very significant ways. So seems like a supernatural thing to me.
Definitely. Okay, so moving on. If deathbed experiences are caused by purely physical aspects of dying, then what accounts for post-death visions reported by people who are not experiencing the same physical causes? Steve, why don't you go ahead and elaborate on that one a little bit for us?
Okay, post-death experiences, like, are we into after-death communications at this point?
Well, yeah, so we're going to be transitioning into that one. So under the phenomena of death with your chapter 3, you have, if deathbed experiences are caused by purely physical aspects of dying, then what accounts for post-death visions reported by people who are not experiencing the same physical causes? So this kind of co-aligns with the I understand this kind of starts to fall into after death communications, which, and in the next line of evidence you go over that with if after death communications are attributed to purely physical characteristics of the grieving, then how do we explain the seemingly supernatural elements of such
Yeah,
phenomena?
that's starting on the after death communication. So what we're finding is that perfectly healthy people, particularly the grieving, let's say, uh, they've they've lost a loved one, a wife, or someone in the family, and then sometimes soon after the death. But sometimes it's not like a shared death experience where it's at the same time. But this is later, maybe a year later. All of a sudden, you get a very dramatic, realer than real communication from this other person on the other side. Again, the person who's experiencing it, they don't have a dying brain. This is a very healthy person. It's unlike a hallucination. They believe it was real. How do you explain that?
Okay.
And we'll go in this time to some of the specifics on that as well.
Yeah. So we're gonna jump into that now. Ladies and gentlemen, that was just a quick review of the lines of evidence up to this point so far. So again, as always, if you guys have any questions or comments on initially those points that we've reviewed, feel free to go back to some of the previous episodes to hear our in-depth breakdown, our in-depth conversations on those particular points. But today we'd like to jump into further. We touched on after death communications last week. We want to get into those a little more this week, and then we'll finish up with the last couple of lines of evidence today, and then give our closing thoughts on deathbed experiences as a whole, and where do we think that they lead us in terms of worldviews and beliefs and so on and so forth. What can we, because ultimately that's the hope, right, Steve, is what can we draw down from these lines of evidence to come to a conclusion to say, based on this evidence, this leads me to believe this is true, and I can have good faith in that.
And what we're encouraging our listeners to do is to not just trust our assessment of it, but once you see, if you agree with us about the content, about the data that we're saying, then how do you assess it? Do you give that on a scale of 0 to 10? Do you give that a 10 and saying, "Oh my goodness, there's got to be an afterlife," or 5 could be, could not be, somewhere in the middle, or a 0? Just honestly, because we're helping you assess what you think about the afterlife from these experiences. So go ahead and give us line of evidence number 9.
Okay, so if after death communications are attributed to purely physical characteristics of the grieving, then how do we explain the seemingly supernatural elements of such phenomena?
Okay, so this is a widely reported phenomenon. This is not anomalous. This is anomalous to naturalism, but it's not anomalous to human experience. In fact, we saw that a doctoral dissertation had been done on this, and that they found like a third of the people in large surveys had said they had seen someone alive, not physically, but they saw the person at a later time after they had died. Okay, like 1 out of 3 human beings. Okay, now if you spread that out to the entire earth, you got 2.4 billion people testifying they've seen somebody who's already dead. So this is a widely experienced thing. Now let's look at a few examples of this just to show how I believe this is not just a hallucination. So one thing about them is that they have unexpected elements. So naturalists is going to tend to say, okay, you've got this person who died, they were close to you, so you're wanting to see them. So your brain may very well manufacture an experience with them, and the content of that would be fed by what you would expect in such an experience. The problem is that a lot of it comes unexpected and it's just jarring to them. They're not trying to manufacture it anyway. It's not that they heard there are such experiences and they're expecting it, but it's different. Like one person, and these are all, again, well documented. Most of these are from Guggenheim, and Guggenheim, they collected like 3,300 after death communications. And they've got a little book here called Hello, Hello from Heaven. Guggenheim's collected these, but and they put them helpfully in chapters where you can look at a chapter of the unexpected, or a chapter. They're logical and topical, in their organization. But this one widow, she was just laying in bed, and all of a sudden, her deceased husband comes out and says, "I'm fine. I remember all the things I was and knew and felt. I will go on being me, learning and building my life. Yet I will be here waiting for you when you come." In other words, this deceased husband came back unexpectedly and said, "Hey, I'm on the other side. There is an afterlife, right? I'm over here waiting for you, and it's still me. I'm not something else. I'm not reincarnated as something else. I'm actually me." Now, in this case, even if she expected to hear from her deceased spouse, she would expect him to come talking to him through his voice. But she says specifically in this example that he was talking to her mind to mind, much as we hear about in near death experiences. So this is totally expected. Um, Other reports from ADCers, after death communications people. "I was in shock for a second or two. I was greatly astonished," another says. "I was stunned by this experience." Another person says, "This message was totally opposite to anything I was prepared to believe at the moment." So this is not something that was expected uh, by them. And again, under naturalism, you'd think the content would be expected content. Another one said, another case, "Tom and I grew up together. We were next door neighbors, but I hadn't heard from him since he entered the priesthood. I lost complete contact with him and his family after I moved to Texas. One night, over 10 years later, I woke up out of a sound sleep. I saw Tom standing at the bottom of my bed in a Navy uniform. When I saw his uniform, I couldn't believe it because I thought he was a Catholic priest. He said, 'Goodbye, Melinda. I'm leaving now.' Then he disappeared. My husband woke up. I told him what had happened, but he said I was just dreaming. 3 days later, I got a letter from my mother stating that Tom had just been killed in action. I also found out he had been a chaplain in the Navy. She didn't know that. This was unexpected. She didn't expect him to be in a military uniform. She didn't expect anything. She didn't know he had died. She had not been even in touch in years, and yet he came back. In every ADC case I've read, when people are told of the death, the timing is always accurate. And the Guggenheims record 15 of these accounts in their chapter dedicated to this phenomenon. So there's just example after example I give. And again, it's not just a few examples out of billions of people, but about a third of the population claims to have had these type experiences. Now,
Well,
I wrote to the Guggenheims because I said, "What if, okay, are you just telling us the ones that got it right, but did others, were there errant claims in any of the deceased?" And he said, "In short, I don't recall any accounts in which the living person received information that was incorrect." Like I was thinking, okay, if a lot of people are having dreams that people
mhm.
are dying, and then, but actually, in most cases, they're not actually dying, but we're just collecting examples of the ones that happen to be right, that's not really much indicative of the afterlife. But he told me and everyone that he's heard, it was correct information, which is significant from an evidential standpoint.
Well, and I think from a naturalistic standpoint, he makes a great observation of why would you have a grief-induced hallucination before you were aware that a death had occurred? And I think that
Yes.
that's incredibly important to note because if you were to try to attribute it to some kind of emotional concoction internally with chemicals or misfiring of the brain or something like that in response to the information, then you might have a footing to try to get off with. But seeing as they're having these phenomena occur before they even realize what has happened, then there's not really any trauma to create the experience. Now, maybe you would argue that, well, after the trauma happens, then it changes how they're remembering things. I mean, I guess that would be the route you could take with that. But that would definitely be that would definitely be reaching.
Well, let me give you another example which shows another line of evidence. Well, it's not a separate line of evidence, but another piece of data bolstering this as something that's evidential. So Leslie reported seeing her father who had died of cancer 4 years earlier. "I'd just gone to bed, turned the light off when I saw my father standing in the doorway. All the lights were out of the house, yet I could see him very clearly because there was a glow around him. I kept thinking, this is really Daddy. This is really him. I was so excited. I sat up and said, Daddy. I wanted to go over and touch him, and I started to get out of bed. He smiled and said, no, no, you can't touch me now. I began to cry and kept saying, let me come to you. He said, no, you can't do that, but I want you to know that I'm all right. Everything is fine. I'm always with you. Again, that's evidence of the afterlife. Here's somebody, um, 4 years dead, and he's very conscious on the other side saying, don't worry about me. I'm fine. Then he paused and said, I have to go look in on your mother and Curtis, which was her son, his grandson. Curtis is my son. He and my father were in the next room. He and my mother, I'm sorry, were in the next room. I got up, followed my father to the hallway, but he disappeared, just faded away. So she went to bed thinking, okay, like anybody else. Okay, this is just my grief. This has got to be a hallucination.
Yeah.
Surely this can't be right. So I fell asleep after tossing and turning for some time. Next morning, I got up, and Curtis, who was 3 years old at the time, almost 4, came out in the hallway. He said, Mommy, I saw Granddaddy last night. My mouth fell open, and I said, You did? He said, Yes, he came to my room. He was standing at my bed. And she says, how can a 3-year-old come up with that?
Mm.
She said, were you dreaming? He said, no, Mommy, I had my eyes open. I was awake. I saw him. So that's a confirmation from another person. So usually when we're trying to come up with a naturalistic explanation or an ADC, we say, oh, this person was longing to see them, or who knows
Yeah.
what, they
Right.
got some inflicted. But then why would the other person have the same hallucination
Yeah.
on the same night?
Right.
That's pretty remarkable. So, rate that. Whatever you think. This has been studied a good bit. Again, doctoral dissertations written on it, big collections that you can look at. But how do you rate that on a scale of 0 to 10? I think it's more likely, whether I put it a 6 or an 8 or what, I put it more likely afterlife as opposed to a naturalistic hypothesis.
Yeah, it's interesting because it has me like this thought just hit me that after death communications are in and of themselves definitely hard to explain, but I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of mediums discussing. It would be interesting to see the correlations between like mediums and the studies done on mediums and the conversations they have in terms of after death communications, to see if there were any parallels or overlaps between the two worlds. The two worlds. That's just kind of a thought that's hitting me right now, Steve. I don't know if you've ever like looked at that, because I'm sure, that's not really anything that I've studied in depth. I don't know if you've looked at it at all in terms of, because wouldn't you say that after death communications could potentially have some overlap with mediums and kind of those conversations?
Well, I think it comes with a warning is the
Mm,
main thing I could say, is that what Charlie and I believe is that there actually is another side over there. There's another side where we're seeing heavenly things going on. We're seeing deceased relatives. We're seeing um, angels. And the Bible talks about this other world where there are angels and there are demons. So there's not only benevolent beings, but there are malevolent beings on the other side. So these people, in every case that I could see, at least that I think is relevant, they're not pursuing the other side. This is something that comes passively to them.
mm,
Um, but mediums are trying to help people make contact with the other side. Now, those type experiences, yes, they're claiming to see a deceased loved one, but I'm suspicious of those because God tells us in His Word not to pursue the other side through mediums. Don't go and visit mediums. Why? Well, uh, demons could pose as a deceased relative. You could be led astray through that. So I have no idea what I'm going to find on the other side if I pursue it. Even through deep meditation of trying to clear my mind of all my thoughts and do mantras that are going to just bypass logic and get me over there. I don't see the Bible recommending that as a way to wisdom. I see that we're supposed to pray for wisdom. If any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. who gives to all men generously, without reproach, it will be given to him. If I pray about something that I need to know about a deceased relative and God doesn't give it to me, he's generous with his wisdom. If he didn't give it to me, I assume I don't need it. And for sure, I don't need to go through a medium in order to try to contact the other side. So, yes, there's some parallels, but some obvious warnings that I'm going to bring up concerning that.
Yeah, I guess it's just like, and I don't mean to digress this too much. I just think it's a relevant point.
So this is important because there's a person from, I believe it's from Great Britain, who contacted me via email and said, okay, I'm with you. I believe in another side, but I really, really want to see my deceased wife.
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to go to a medium? I'm like, no, 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 no. Please don't go that direction. Because you may see somebody and it may look like your wife, but how do you know it's your wife? And then are you going to want to keep seeking wisdom through a medium which diverts you from that intimate relationship with God, seeking wisdom from Him and general wisdom through other wise people?
So to kind of stay in this kind of internal critique mode, Steve, you're mentioning that people shouldn't be seeking mediums out because we don't necessarily know if we open a door what walks through the door, and it very well it could you could perceive it as someone that you know and love or whatever, but the information that it's giving you would be misleading or information that leads you down a destructive pathway. So to kind of put you back on the defense here, I'd ask you, you mentioned, well, you don't know if that person's your significant other. You don't know if that person's, your deceased relative. Then how could you say in the Guggenheim study that the people that they're communicating with weren't some kind of malicious entity looking to kind of manipulate or mess with them? Because again, from the internal critique standpoint, we believe the afterlife hypothesis is true because the evidence we have is good evidence. And then let's say, all right, very well, we'll go from there to say there are good and bad entities on the other side, right? And that the reason we are hesitant to consider after-death communications is because we aren't really sure of the source of that information, right? In that it could be a demon, it could be an angel, it could be from heaven, hell, whatever. And so I guess my question to you would be, since we're very vigilant to try to be, I don't want to say anti-medium, but very avoiding that pathway, because again, we don't know what we're going to get out of that. What makes the after-death communications that we're getting in the Guggenheim study here any better?
Well, I'd say number one, they're passive. We didn't go after them through a medium, which God disallows from the start. Okay, so that's one mark for them. But I think my response is that some of them may be demonic. Some of them may be of God. We're not supposed to just blindly accept all visions as being from God. We're not supposed to throw them all out and saying they're all of the devil. Woe to him, it says in the Old Testament, woe to him who calls evil good and good evil. So are these good or evil? Well, we don't know. Woe to us if we just say that they're all evil, if some are really of God. And we know that sometimes people see the deceased and it is of God. Look at the transfiguration. In that case, Jesus was speaking to two Old Testament saints. They were here alive, they were dead. This is an after-death communication. The Apostle Paul taught to Jesus after his death, resurrection, and ascension. He taught to Jesus. So we can't say that they're all necessarily of the devil. So how do we evaluate them? Well, First Thessalonians says, do not quench the spirit. I think it's quenching the spirit when we take something that might really be of God and we just say, no, 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 that's potentially dangerous. Just throw it away. We don't want to quench it if it might be from God. Do not despise prophetic utterances, but examine everything carefully. Now, that gets a little messy, but we've got to use the brains God has given us, use the spirit that God has put into our lives, and discern things. Examine everything carefully. Hold fast to that which is good. Okay, so in each of the cases that I've given, it looks to me like the results are good. someone who is grieving is assured that their relative is alive on the other side. That sets their eyes on things to come. That sets their eyes on God, to pursue God because life matters, your decisions matter. So I think that's a good result. And it's an encouragement to those of us who are left behind. So the fruit of it seems to be good, number one. Number two, I don't see anything that contradicts scriptures where the scripture doesn't say that these things could never happen. In fact, we see instances where they did happen.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way I would evaluate it in each case rather than blindly accepting all or rejecting all.
Hmm. Yeah. I think, I would rate it a little bit lower just based off of kind of this conversation and kind of retrospect on it. Because ultimately, I think it's good evidence for the afterlife. I guess then I have to retract what I said then. Now that I'm thinking about it, it is good evidence for the afterlife, I would say. But in terms of how much further you could take it, that's where I would be suspect, because I could see the waters getting really murky between these people having after death communications and people being like, well, what's the difference between me going to a medium and having a conversation there? And it's a good conversation, Steve. It was so good. It was so good. So that's how I know, God wanted me to have it. And I think that that's the slippery slope where you can't really know if something's good until you have the ability to evaluate the short-term and the long-term consequences of it. Really? Wouldn't you agree with that, Steve? Because it's like there are things that, and we see this happen all the time in life. Let's say like drugs, for example. Drugs are notorious for their ability to give you the perception of something very good in the short term, which you could argue, yeah, it is a benefit, and that's why you would have it in medical situations. For example, morphine, for example. You'd want to give morphine to someone who's in pain because the short-term good is so much better than the short-term loss, right? And that's why we would okay medicine in that situation. That's where you'd be discerning. But if you were to say long term, we're going to keep you on morphine, then we would probably disagree with that, because we say, well, this isn't long term. The benefit is not the pros do not outweigh the cons long term, and so therefore it is not a good thing to do long term. And so that's where I would say, in order to properly perceive something as good, you have to have both the short term and the long term consequences available to make a fully balanced conclusion on whether something is good or bad. Steve, what do you think about that? You agree, disagree?
I think you make a good point, and I think what someone could do is what Sabom did for near-death experiences. He looked at patients who had had near-death experiences and said, let's look at the long-term result. Did this help them to get more involved in church and to eventually seek God and read their Bibles and pray? He and Sartori both found that it did end up with that. And so they said, okay, we're evaluating the long-term impact, not just the short term. So that could be done. I don't think that's been done on after-death communications, and I think that's a good point. But what you might say is, since there is evidence that there are these people on the other side who actually have knowledge of things that giving us knowledge of things that we couldn't have ordinarily known, like somebody's about to die or whatever. If that's true, then even if it's demonic, it's evidence of knowledge on the other side. So it is evidence that there is a spiritual reality there. You're just saying you're not convinced this is giving us evidence of the afterlife. And I think you make a good point. I'm seeing it as a little stronger than you are, but that's why we assess these things. We're doing exactly what the Bible says, to examine everything carefully, and it takes time looking at the ins and outs, thinking about these cases and see what they mean to us and where they're coming from.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go ahead and move on to line of evidence number 10. So, if deathbed phenomena can be attributed to the expectations of the dying, then why do so many of the characteristics of deathbed experiences come unexpected?
Yeah, so we've hit on that a little bit, the unexpectedness of some of the, well, we've seen it in near-death experiences, we've seen it in deathbed visions. We've seen it in after-death communications. People that say, oh, people are just seeing what they expect from their worldview and what they want to see. We're saying, no, these are really just coming very much as surprises. And I mean, if you're a secular person, you're not expecting to see people on the other side at all.
Hmm.
You're not expecting a deathbed vision or something of this sort. So, and then when I look at myself, what am I expecting at death? Well, because of a mixture of popular culture and the Bible, I'm kind of expecting, okay, when I really have a final death, what I'm expecting is to somehow come before God and He's going to, you know, talk to me about eternal things or I'm expected to come before God. I'm not expecting to be hanging out with angels, looking down at my body, doing all these things that we're talking about in near death and deathbed experiences. And so that's why when people are seeing these things, having these experiences, whether it's themselves or seeing other people at death in a shared death experience, that they just express utter amazement that it's happening because they're not expecting that at all. So one bishop said, it is evident, Bishop Whately, this is a good while in the past, but he said, it is evident that when many coincide in their testimony, if many people are saying these things, like we found with deathbed visions, crisis apparitions, after death communications, if many people are saying the same thing, okay, where there's no previous concert or gathering together where they've all decided ahead of time what they're going to say, the probability resulting from this concurrence does not rest on the supposed veracity of each considered separately. In other words, it's not so much that we have to go look into each person saying, are these sincere people or not? Even if they were just trying to lie, he
Hmm.
says, but what the evidence rests on is the improbability of such an agreement taking place by chance. For though in each case, in such a case, each of the witnesses should be considered as unworthy, even if they were considered unworthy of credit, and even more likely to speak falsehood than truth, still the chances would be infinite against their all agreeing on the same falsehood. You have to read those statements a little bit. He's being very precise
Mm.
in an antiquated way. But what he's saying is, what are the odds that you'd have this unexpected thing happen that's not buried according to people's worldview and expectations, and yet the basic elements of it are consistent from culture to culture, from person to person, and you bring them together and you say, yeah, that's just like so and so said in India, that's just like so and so said in Korea. And so we're not expecting this, and yet they happen.
So,
um
wouldn't it be safe to say there, Steve, that it's kind of like an argument that you've ruled out all the other potential options, and therefore truth, the fact that these experiences are true, is the only thing you're left with? Because
that's the
essentially,
only thing I'm left with, is that somehow this experience is not naturalistic in origin. It must be something from God. Or why the consistency from culture to culture of unexpected experiences that wouldn't be expected from their own culture and religious experience.
I mean, that's essentially what Archbishop is saying. Is he's saying that if you look at the playing field and you evaluate all these people and what these people are saying, the likelihood that there is just this grand conspiracy and that they're all lying is essentially zero. I mean, he says it's infinite. So essentially it's zero likelihood that they could be lying, and so therefore the only other probable explanation is that they're all telling the truth and that they are having these experiences and these experiences are happening.
I
Un-
think that's a good way to put it.
Unless, of course, again, I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here because I want to try to cover these bases. If I'm trying to make sense of this from a naturalistic perspective, I guess you would try to make the argument that the physiological conditions of the body are all the same to create these experiences. But again, I don't know, man, that feels like a really far shot out there because you just have so many different circumstances, as we've covered through this series. You just have so many different circumstances in which these lines of evidence are occurring that to say that all these people are in the same condition, either emotionally or mentally or physically, it's just simply not true.
And again, the shared death experience being one,
Right.
it's not a dying brain that's having it. So how can you attribute it to a common physical malady or experience? And I think what this kind of segues us into the whole thing of children, because we're not children do not have the type of more developed worldview or religious view that the rest of us have. I have grandchildren, 3 and 5, and they just don't have very good worldview about things. They've just got a hodgepodge of ideas going through their mind, very little about death. People aren't talking to them about death. So this amazed Dr. Comp. She wrote a book called A Window to Heaven. Dr. Comp is a very well respected pediatric oncologist. She taught at Yale. She was also an kind of vacillated between atheism and existentialism, she says. But what brought her over to believe in God and believe in Jesus and the Bible is when she began to work with children who were dying and to see how many of them died that had supernaturally seeming experiences with them. So, and there have been studies done on children and death, and so there are a lot of cases, but children have less refined filters than most adults. And I'll give you an example. My former wife, passed away from cancer. But when she was a young child, she was in church one day and she looked up in the choir and saw a person who was a dwarf, I guess you could say, very small. And she just stood up in church and pointed and said, "Look, a monkey." And of course, her her parents were terribly embarrassed. Everyone was embarrassed. But that's the way children are. They see something, they call it like they see it. They don't tend to have a larger worldview to pull from.
Yeah.
So when children began saying these things at death, Dr. Comp said, "Now, wait a minute. These children seem to know more than their parents do about their death. They're not being told about their death off. You usually don't tell a child, 'Oh, you've probably got a few days left, you're going to die.' Then you got to explain death to them. They can't even understand it as a 3 or 5 year old. So you don't even talk about that. It seems like in multiple cases, the children knew what was about to happen. They were
Yeah.
excited about what was awaiting them on the other side. They were trying to minister to their parents to say, 'Don't worry,
Hmm.
I'm going, but you're going to be okay. I'm going to be okay.' And they kept trying to communicate that to minister to their parents, which is, where in the world does that come from? If you've got this little bitty worldview and nobody's even telling you about death. So there's a 5-year-old diagnosed with leukemia. Um, the father said, "We were leaving the hospital," and Nathan said, "God is coming in 1999. I knew that that was like a year before. He said, "I knew that maybe there was something that he was trying to prepare us for," but he just said he was so excited about going to heaven, and he was even more excited about going to heaven than going to Florida on his Make-A-Wish trip. He was excited about this. Why would you be excited about something that was unknown to you? And again, he did end up dying. In another case, one child whose father had been very receptive from the very moment his daughter had shared her vision with him eagerly asked her dad, "Can I go? Can I go now?" Although the father readily consented, he asked if she could wait for her sister to come, which she did, but not before begging, "Do I have to?" She was ready to go to the other side. We don't expect that from someone. This is from one of Angela Ethier's experiences from her dissertation for a Doctor of Science from the University of Texas. Physicist William Barrett was greatly impressed with the fact that so many children said that they saw angels on the other side and they would ask to describe them and they wouldn't mention having wings. Of course, in the Bible, there are some heavenly creatures with wings, but none of them are called angels, and it's never said that all angels have wings. But that's so pervasive in our culture that
Yeah.
all angels have wings that children are going to expect it, right? So if they see what they're going to expect to see on the other side of their dying, they're going to say, "Oh, I see these angels fluttering around with their wings." But from one of the interviews, um, one preschool, this is before they've been in school, after gaining her mother's trust via a pinky promise, she became quite serious, asking her mother if she could see the angels in the room. The mother, feeling a little inferior, responded yes, to which the child told her to describe the angels. This is a little investigator, okay? Mine has big wings, replied the mother. The little preschooler says, "Mama, you don't have to lie. They don't have wings," responded the child, who went on to describe in vivid detail what the angels looked like. Why would they be having these experiences right before they die when they're not having them at any other time in their life? And they know this is taking them on to the afterlife. So Dr. Comp, who saw experience after experience after experience like this brought her to belief in God and the afterlife. This one girl, a 7-year-old, Hannah, was dying of leukemia. According to Dr. Comp, again, this is a professor at Yale, right? An oncologist. Before she died, this is a 7-year-old, she mustered the final energy to sit up in her hospital bed and say, "The angels, they're so beautiful, Mommy. Can you see them? Do you hear their singing? I've never heard such beautiful singing." Then she laid back on her pillow and died. Her parents acted as if they'd been given the most precious gift in the world. Eventually, as Dr. Comp reflected on these, she said, she realized that she had been filtering her observations through her secular worldview. And once she got more objective, and she said, quote, "I realized that in my acquired deafness, I might not know everything about my patients that was important to know. With the retuning of my ear, I became more objective, less censoring listener." Usually, naturalists are saying that we are the ones, the spiritual people, are the ones who lack objectivity. She was saying she lacked objectivity because she was a naturalist who kept trying to interpret these things
Yeah.
in a naturalistic perspective. When she looked at it more more objectively, she said, "Wow, it really makes more sense to think that these children are just about to go to the afterlife. And how do they know they're going to the afterlife when they've not been told? They don't understand death. Why are they excited going to a place where they'd be separated from everything they loved? If they were conjuring up a pleasant experience, wouldn't they be envisioning time with their parents? Wouldn't they be envisioning getting healed and going back to playing their regular things?" It just makes more sense to me in the afterlife hypothesis.
Yeah, G.K. Chesterton has a famous quote where he says that the natural man is the most limited thinker of all because he can never consider the supernatural.
Hmm. And we can all be unobjective. We can all be subjective about our beliefs. But we have to consider, do the best we can to objectively look at these and see which hypothesis they best fit into. So that's basically what I've done. I could go into a lot more stories there of children, and they're all
No,
fascinating.
yeah.
Get my book, read them. They're documented. These aren't just things off the internet. These are from doctoral studies. These are from someone who's teaching at Yale. These are not just coming out of nowhere. I document them. So my conclusion at the end of the book was, once I started pulling all these lines of evidence together, so I have 11 of them for deathbed experiences, 12 lines of evidence for near death experiences. Once I looked at them all, once I said, okay, let's put a number on these. I think this is, about an 8 out of 10, a 9 out of 10. Pulled together, you have a cumulative case. So what I did is to take all of my ratings of each line of evidence for deathbed experiences. And I said, where do I go with this? Okay. What kind of math could help me pull this together? And what I found is I asked an economist at Kennesaw State, you came up with some formulas I could use, and I don't want to go into math or everybody will stop listening. But if you plug your numbers into this formula, it's much like a weather report. Okay, so you've got for each hour what the possibility of rain is. Okay, it's 20% chance of rain at 10 o'clock. You've got an 80% chance of rain at 2 o'clock. Then you got a 10% chance of rain at 5 o'clock in the evening. What's the percentage chance that it's going to rain today? Well, you don't add up those percentages and divide them by 3 or however many I said. That just gives you an average. If it's an 80% chance that it'll rain at 2 or 3, then there's at least an 80% chance that it's going to rain today. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this is the kind of the formula we're working with. So if you put one of these lines of evidence as an 8 out of 10, then your 80% chance, you've got an 80% chance there's an afterlife just from that one line of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say you've got other lines of evidence that are 20%, 90%, 70%, 50%. All of those add to the cumulative case. It's like you're saying, okay, what are the odds that a devastating hurricane is going to come through here, or a tornado, depending on where you're located? Well, if you say, well, there's 10% possibility because of this weather pattern, then there's a 90% because of this weather pattern, then there's this. Each of those percentages, even if it's just 10%, that adds to the probability that it's going to happen. So when I put my numbers into the formula, it came up to over 99, it was like 99.99% chance that there's an afterlife. And that's coming from my figures, which applies to me. And it helped me to look at it and say, wow, I didn't know I was so sure. But once I add up all those as a cumulative case, I realize, wow, I really am warranted to say, yeah, there's an afterlife. I
Mm-hmm.
think there's good evidence for it. And I should say too, I've been through so much evidence in this book. I mean, there's just tons of footnotes of evidence and studies. But to pull those together, let's put it this way. Let's say that let's say you're a wealthy businessman and you say, I don't have the time or ability to study out something like that, but I'm going to pay some solid researchers some good money to study out this afterlife thing and see if there's some evidence. And so you go and pay others to do it. That would be one way to gather evidence for the afterlife. I'd say, okay, you don't have to pay them because I've already documented some people who had great credentials in various fields to study these things, and they studied them. We looked at the Sidgwicks, who studied 17,000 people. Look at their study. And they determined, hey, these people, that this just can't be a result of chance, that they were actually seeing people who were at the point of death within a 24-hour period of their death. They wrote up after that, they wrote a 400-page journal article on it. They put it in 2 volumes of 1,300 pages, their preliminary study. Frederick Myers, a classic scholar who was also involved in both of these studies, he wrote up his conclusions in 2 volumes of 1,300 pages. He concluded there was an afterlife. Sir William Barrett, one of the most respected physicists of his time, followed the 1800s research, collected his own cases throughout his life, wrote 3 books on them. This is a lifetime of study. He said the best explanation, there's an afterlife. Camille Flammarion, one of the top astronomers of his time in France, he solicited early in his life deathbed phenomena cases from 3 French journals. He said, I want to hear if you've got deathbed phenomena in your lives. He received 1,800 responses that he assessed in several books. Toward the end of his life, he published 3 volumes assessing hundreds of cases. His conclusion, a mind, spirit, soul exists separate from the material brain. Our conscious existence indeed survives death. So if you were a wealthy person who hired people, and I've got others, Osis and Harrelson, they were actually hired, their study was funded by the inventor of the Xerox machine to go study deathbed visions in America, and then later they did it in India and compared the two. Their conclusion, it fits best with an afterlife hypothesis. I think there's just abundant evidence. I've tried to sum it up for you, and I'm convinced there's
Yeah.
an afterlife.
Well, and I think, Steve, one of the things you're trying to establish there is this isn't just like a phenomenon that's happening in a corner somewhere and we have a few researchers who are paying attention. I think what you're trying to do with listing it all out is establishing not only do we have a great amount of evidence, we also have a great quality in that evidence. And so we have both quantity and quality when being able to look at the evidence that's available to us to then start coming to conclusions about whether something is true or isn't true. And as C.S. Lewis says, that the ultimate question for us to answer in this existence is if God exists, then that completely alters everything, right? And so for me, I look at it from the standpoint of if you're using deathbed experiences and in these, but primarily we've been focusing on deathbed. So if you're using this to establish, is there an afterlife, then what are the implications of that? What follows beyond that? And I think that those are you might even argue those are the more important questions that follow, is because what those will start to do is inform you on the four things: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, and how you begin to answer
And
those
how
questions.
important are those?
Yeah.
List those for me one more time slowly.
Yeah.
What are we
Origin,
talking about?
origin,
Where did we come from?
right? Meaning,
Meaning, what is life all about? That's kind of important, isn't it?
yeah. Morality,
Morality, what's right to do, what's wrong to do, what should I spend my time today doing?
yeah. So I would look at like meaning as what life is all about, and morality is about how do you achieve what life is all about, right?
Hmm.
So it's kind of like how you get there and what you're trying to get to are equally important. That's where the
Yes,
expression
yes,
like the road
yes.
to hell is paved with good intentions, that's where people care about short term, but they don't care about long term, right? And then finally, destiny. That's the fourth one, which is where are we going? What is all of this heading towards, right?
For me, heaven heaven changed everything when I was a
Right,
sophomore in high school.
right.
And all of a sudden, life just had no meaning before then. I mean, I knew I was supposed to be nice to people. I knew I had a responsibility to be kind to my parents, to get through school and be nice to people. I felt like those were important. But all of a sudden, when I realized, hey, there's an eternity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't have to get even with people today. Justice will be done. You know, it counts where if I'm loving other people, it's okay if somebody else gets ahead of me in some area of life, like making money or their vocation, because this is just 60 or 70 or 80 years. And compared to eternity, this is very little. This
Mm-hmm.
is really very little. What does it profit a man, Jesus said, to gain the whole
World
world and lose or
loses soul.
forfeit himself
Yeah.
or his soul? Why? Well, it doesn't. But what it does is it fills life with meaning because even the smallest things, like my wife had was given a new knee last Monday, a week ago Monday. I've been mostly taking care of her. And I wouldn't have done this interview if she had said, I really need you sitting by my side right now. Helping her recover from that, that's as important as it gets. Why? Because I love her, and because God said loving your neighbor, particularly my closest neighbor, which is my wife, okay, that counts for everything.
Mm-hmm.
So even if I don't get a best-selling book or, some great fame in this life matters. Little choices matter. It brings life alive in a way that just fills my life with purpose, even with the smallest things. That's
Absolutely.
just wonderful. Eternity changes everything.
Right. And that's the hope behind these studies. That's the hope behind this podcast. That's the hope behind the research and the conversation, is to help people feel a sense of we don't want anyone to have blind faith. That's not what the Bible calls for. And there are verses people quote all the time that are completely out of context and complete misunderstandings of the situations that these people are in. The Bible wants us, Christ, God wants us to be informed, to love the Lord your God with your heart, your soul, and your mind. That means all of your being, all of your capacity. So you should chase down the information. You should chase down the leads. You should search. You shouldn't just leave questions unanswered, because I believe that there are answers out there. Now, not to say that every question is going to be answered completely satisfactory, but there are answers out there that we just have to spend time looking for. And then I think we'll be surprised by the results that we get, which allow us to come to conclusions of what are these experiences trying to push us towards? What is the evidence want us to come to a conclusion of? And then what are the consequences of coming to that conclusion? And consequences don't have to be a bad thing. They can be good consequences, right? We can come to belief that the afterlife is true and real, and then start to explore the worldviews that try to make sense of the afterlife, that try to illuminate the afterlife. But what I think is, and we obviously don't have time to get into this today, but I would love to dedicate some time in the future as to why I think Christianity is by far and away the best answer to what is origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, and what makes sense of the afterlife, right? I think Christianity has the most robust and accurate framework of all the world religions out there. And you may say something like, Charlie, well, there are truths in these other religions, which I would say there are truths in these other religions.
Of course, yes.
But we're not looking for truths in other religions. We're looking for the truth, right? The way. We're looking for the life. And it just so happens that there was a person who came to this planet and called themselves that. And so therefore, we want to explore why they have good reasons to say that and why we should believe them when they do say that. And I think that this all ties back into afterlife apologetics, because we see those truths that Jesus lived echoed in the elements of deathbed experiences and of near-death experiences, of which, I'm really excited to get into in the future, is dealing with some of the objections that we have gotten on this channel, which I'm very excited to go into great detail on those. But of course, also let you guys kind of hear how Steve and I think about them and how we kind of make sense of them, because it can be a challenging thing ultimately to go through all this evidence and look at some of the communications and say, well, I do believe in an afterlife, but I believe in a Buddhist afterlife, or I do believe in an afterlife, but I do believe in an Islamic afterlife, or I do, place whatever religion you want there, because once we get to an afterlife, that doesn't take us right to Christianity, right, Steve? It just gets us to, there's an afterlife now. Now what do we do? And so I think, we are absolutely going to dedicate episodes in the future of, okay, now that we're at an afterlife, let's go to, why do we have good reasons to believe that Christianity is in fact the truth, right? And I think that we owe that to you guys as our listeners, because I know a lot of you are interested in hearing us talk about the deathbed experiences and the near-death experiences, but our hope is to ultimately create these as an entry point to bring you into the bigger conversation as to what worldview is true, right? Because deathbed and near-death experiences, both Steve and I would say, they'll get you to an afterlife, but where we go from there, there needs to be some other evidence brought in. And as I always like to say, evidence doesn't exist in a vacuum. I don't like going into one field of argumentation and just being like, okay, we're going to come to a conclusion off of that one alone. No, a worldview has to make sense of all the areas of argumentation. It has to make sense of near-death experiences. It has to make sense of morality. It has to make sense of meaning, right? All those 4 questions. It has to make sense of those each areas in order for that to be a worldview that we can adopt in good conscience and not have to shut our brain off for aspects of it. And again, I want to echo that is exactly what the Bible calls us to do, is have a coherent, cohesive worldview, and it gives us the means by which to investigate that. Anything to add to that, Steve?
No, I'd just say to some people, what you just said sounds mean, kind of like, oh, well, you're being exclusive, trying to fit this into Christianity or whatever. And I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just a seeker. I'm seeking for truth. And I can't believe in mutually exclusive claims. So,
Right.
either the Bible was a revelation of God and Jesus was God in the flesh, uh, um, or Islam is true and
Mm-hmm.
Muhammad was really the latest and greatest of prophets, or Mormonism is true, and when you translated these golden plates, that's really the latest and greatest truth.
Yeah.
But they really contradict in how they claim that you get to God. So I can't believe all those. So that forces me as a person, if I'm truly seeking to look at which worldviews fit more closely with the evidence we have in this world. And that evidence includes historical evidence for
Right.
the Quran or for the Book of Mormon or for the Bible. That fits into what do we know about the afterlife. And from what we've said about near death and deathbed experiences, they seem to be clearly pointing to there is a God. He's a personal God. He's not an impersonal God. There is activity and life on the other side. There are people who are deceased who are living, so there is an afterlife. The soul can exit from the bodies, and we're seeing a lot of things confirmed that seem to work better with certain worldviews than others. And surely we'd want to see which worldviews tend to fit that the best. So we can continue to do that in the future. We've done a little bit of it in um, earlier episodes, but we'll continue that. And I used to encourage people to continue to seek. I really believe when Jesus said, seek and keep on seeking in the original Greek. Seek and keep on seeking, and you shall find. You shall seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. If we could produce seekers from this series, I think we've accomplished something really great.
I would agree. I would absolutely agree. Okay, well, that is a great stopping point. Real quick, a few things for you guys. Next week, Steve and I will be doing an episode on the current near-death experience movie that is out and in theaters and doing really well. After Death, produced by Angel Studios. Steve's got a few good friends in there and people I've just read books by. Maybe one day they'll be my friend. I don't know. But be looking forward to that, guys. And like I said, we will be dedicating some episodes in the future to just engaging in general with worldviews as a whole, just so you guys can kind of see how we get from, okay, the afterlife is true to Christianity is true. Okay, that's a big
And
gap.
answering your questions.
Yeah, and answering the questions.
I talk about those questions in my books, and we want to make sure that we cover whatever questions you have. Just keep putting them on there, and we'll be getting to those in the future.
Yeah, so now that we've been able to like lock this up, get it done, again, real quick connection for Steve here. If you guys are interested, Deathbed Experiences as Evidence for the Afterlife, you can go get it on Amazon. Here's what it looks like, Volume 1, and his confusing multi-volume series where Steve likes to release like Volume 6 and then Volume 3, and then, but we'll give him a hard time about that another time. Nonetheless, if you guys want to get the book, that's where you can go get a lot of the stuff that we went through in greater detail. Next week we'll be talking about the movie, so if you want to be up to date, go see the movie, and then we'll be talking about it next week in the podcast, or you can wait. And if we're going to do spoilers or anything like that, we'll absolutely tell you guys like, hey, spoiler alert. But nonetheless.
And if you don't have the money, jstevemiller@gmail.com. I'll send you a free PDF. This is all about getting
for the book,
at the truth,
not for the
and
movie.
seeking God. Not for the movie. The movie you can go to free if people have paid ahead on it. I mean, I think they're trying to be good about this thing as well.
Yeah, you can claim a ticket, I think, on angel.com if you can't afford it. I think you can go there and you can claim tickets that other people have purchased for you to watch. So a lot of good stuff, a lot of good work being done out there for that kind of thing. So looking forward to it, though. We got to end today. We've had a very long episode, but a good one nonetheless. God bless. We'll see you guys in the next one.